At the recent Broad Pool of Ideas Summit, thought leaders committed to an innovative, fresh approach to economic transformation. Radical socio-economic transformation as the ruling party's policy has culminated in a number of robust public engagements, and yet the majority black population remains in the periphery of the economy. We ask, what hinders black progressive formations from unlocking the economic stranglehold in the hands of a few? And joining us is Advisory Council member of the Broad Pool of Ideas and also the CEO of the Small Business Development Institute, and that is Mr. Kulani Kubega. Good morning to you, and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I think let's just cut to the chase in the sense that, are we talking about a leadership issue, lack of political will, or a historical backlog of the apartheid legacy in why black progressive formations are not doing well?
Well, I think you are right. It's a historical perspective, as it were. One must just hasten to say we're dealing with a very huge white-owned business structure, as it were. So we're still reeling from the apartheid economic architecture that continues to favor those who have money. I always say that it takes lots of money to make money, so unfortunately, from a transformation perspective, we have been trying to deal with issues of compliance rather than really of transformation, because the various instruments such as black economic empowerment are more premised on trying to get people to comply to specific procurement requirements, as it were. Now, the danger of that is when you are a black business starting up, some of the elements of these regulations and policy positions, in fact, favor those, who are dominant in the market, as it were.
Okay, so now we agree that in order for the second transition to materialize and economic inclusion is a reality, there needs to be a fresh approach or an innovative way of dealing with the stranglehold of the economy. Talk us through what the programs are, or even certain aspects of legislation that needs to be revisited.
Well, I think there's a plethora of transformational pieces of legislations that purport to drive economic transformation, when in essence, most of these don't talk to one another. I think the first thing for us is that we need to, rewrite what needs to be economic transformation. So in other words, we need to first create a national economic transformation agenda that says, as a country, from an economic transformation perspective, this is what we are trying to do, and therefore any related regulations would then address that. But for now, we have various pieces of legislation, which are, some of them are driven by sectors, and more often than not, you find that these sector charters, as an example, are more monopoly protection of various sectors than in fact opening up the market. So for us, I think we need to be able to go have a colloquium, on all black business as well as the broader black community, including labor, including civil society, and begin, to say, what is it that we should do better? Because purely we're talking about radical economic transformation, which arises, out of policy formation of the ruling party, as it were. But the policies need to be driven from the business people themselves rather than the ruling party, as it were. And for the past 24 years, we've been trying to follow what government has been doing, but it's not working. We continue to have this huge stranglehold between big business and government, as it were.
Is it lack of expertise, lack of research in how you address the issue of inequality, especially economic inequality, from the collective, that the black grouping is not necessarily homogenous, and therefore our approach to things that plague us, the staggering inequality, that we're not able to make a breakthrough purely because either lack of being organized or lack of research and understanding how to approach this monster?
Look, I think even pre-1994, black business formation have tried as much as possible to contribute towards policy formation and partnership, I think, with the ruling party, in particular. I mean, I was part of that group that went into Mopani in October 1993, together with 60 leading leaders of the ANC, in saying, how then in the new dispensation can we work together? But unfortunately, the type of dispensation from an economic transformation perspective that obviously emerged was much more driven from the stranglehold of big business, because who control the levers of power, who have even the leverage on some of our own leaders, unfortunately, to the extent that those even black businesses that have succeeded in the main, they have succeeded because they were able, to partner favorable with large companies. Formulas that obviously were a BE structure that sought for black people to buy into white-owned companies, but without making any major impact.
So what is the alternative? And I go back to the importance of having research and institutionalized knowledge of, one, where we come from, understanding the current climate, and where we're heading as a black populace.
Look, I don't think it's an issue of research. I think black business in the main, and through structures as a Black Business Council, understand what is that need to be done. The only problem and the obstacle standing on the way is that I don't think government, as it were, has the willpower, I think, to sort of shake the tree to ensure that black people can thrive. We try to have piecemeal solutions which are not taking us anywhere. Hence, I'm saying we need to go to the drawing board as black business, as the broader black community, civil society, even labor, and do what Afrikaners did way back in the early 40s, where they tried to deal with Afrikaner poverty and Afrikaner, the fact that Afrikaners at the time were not enjoying a large portion of the economy. They enjoyed probably about 2% of the agrarian economy, so most of them were farmers, as it were. But when they get into power, what the first thing that they did was that, how do we then improve our lot? So they use state institutions, to form, as an example, they formed the IDC. They ensured that through the state-owned enterprises, which were parastatals, then they used them as what are called shop floor universities, to ensure that even those uneducated Afrikaners can be trained, be artisans, and ensure that state power, state purse can be used to propel and drive Afrikaner businesses. Today, Afrikaner businesses, constitute over 60%, of South Africa's economy, because there was a deliberate strategy to empower them. There's not been a deliberate strategy here. There's been too much compromise, as it was. So no matter what research we have, the structure of government, is very skewed. Ordinarily, if you want to tender, you have about 40 to 60 pages that you have to go through. So we need to be able to review the entire, I think, public sector procurement, as it were, because public sector procurement can be able to open up doors and create opportunities for black-owned companies. And I think more often than not, government is really focusing more on numbers, rather than saying, perhaps in this particular sector, if we can target in a specific sector 50, 40 black-owned companies that we can propel in the next 10, 20 years, for them to be large companies that can then be able to drive the development of black-owned small businesses and integrate those into their major value chain, as it were. But we have been more looking at taking over the stock exchange, that black people are occupying the lower levers, within the stock exchange, as it were. There's nothing wrong in being listed, but we should be focusing on how can black people grab new opportunities.
Yes, and I want to come to that, in that, are there key pillars that would enable that, the expedite or fast-track transformation and unlock opportunities where people in the immediate area of influence, or be it a village, or how can they then apply those kind of pillars in current day terms to change their lives?
Well, I think from a first let me just start by saying, for small businesses to happen, there shouldn't be a large reliance on government procurement, though it is important. First, we need to be able to look at how do we nurture people who want to start into the business. What are the support mechanisms that are available, easily available for anyone who wants to start business? What are those programs, which are the interventions that can enable somebody out there who perhaps wants to run a catering business, as an example, to be provided the necessary non-financial support, funding for machinery, funding for whatever tools of the trade that are necessary. Give people, in fact, remove the obstacle to starting up, as it were. So ordinarily, people should be able to do trade. Now it's so even difficult for people to do trade because we sometimes think business is only contracting with the government. 60% of the economy is into food, retail, and all of those, so which doesn't really require government, but it requires people to be able to produce something, to sell something, as it were. Of course, your business, as a business, you have dreams to be big, but to start small. Almost all companies in the stock exchange they started small, but with a view to grow. So the perspective, should change. Therefore, we need what I termed a master plan for South Africa that says this is how we're going to drive economic transformation. This is how we're going to industrialize, but making sure that we take along black-owned companies as we industrialize.
And as, a panel member to the broad-based, or rather broad pool of ideas beyond blackness, which was the theme for the summit over the weekend, you lament the inaction, the fact that we're all about talk, a lack of evaluation, monitoring, and implementing just a general strategy in how we deal with issues of economic transformation. Just expand a little bit on that, on how then will you change that narrative?
Well, I think, as I'm saying, first we need to agree even with government, with even the ruling party, that we need to redefine what we're trying to achieve, you see. And sometimes we need even whilst foreign direct investment is important, we need to stop using that as an excuse to radically transform this economy, because there's always this notion that if we become too radical, then foreign investors will not come. In fact, foreign investors would come if that clear-cut mechanism that says, as South Africa, we understand your past, and therefore, for us to catapult black people from the periphery of the economy to the epicenter, something must break. It means there must be drastic action, because if you want real change, then something must break. We must break the stranglehold, for instance, between big business and government, because some of the government mechanisms do not work, because government is very wary of what a big business, is doing. Let me give an example. Right now, we're talking about the VBS issue, and sort of the failure of VBS. For me, it's not a failure, rather than there are certain strategic issue that should happen, as an example. Therefore, government should be able to say deliberately, we're going to put resources into VBS and make it work. If it is skills they need, if it is governance issues, we will do that. We have a history where, as an example, African Bank collapsed during, I think, the new dispensation. A bank which was established, before 1993, which was mobilized by leadership of black business, as it were. But when it had challenges, it was left to collapse, to the extent that that license was then acquired by white business, as it were. But when the new African Bank collapsed, which now was white-owned, government, I think, put in excess of 2 billion rands to try and save the same bank, And so, therefore, what is different with VBS? Because we need to be able to say, what are those structural issues with VBS? And then remove, if it's a management issue, then those that are responsible.
Yeah, but with all the cloud of controversy and allegations of corruption, etc., and fraud within the bank, one would argue that it is tarnished. Would rather have an alternative where you have a black bank. It's not the first business that would have been tarnished. We have a number of institutions.
businesses that I think have had issues with corruption. So it is not the business that is corrupt. It is specific individuals within that. Now, obviously, you have shareholders. So the shareholders of the bank should be able to make sure that they deal with the corrupt officials and make sure that the law takes its hand, and then recruit new management. Rather than think you can destroy. This is a brand that has withstood, time as an example, because it comes from the apartheid era. All it needs to be nourished. Why would a black bank must look for alternative when African bank, which is now in white hands, was not left to say, let's find an alternative? It was assisted to come out of its illiquidity position. Today, it's doing well. It's restructured.
Okay, let's talk again about how we achieve and fulfill the black aspirations, which is the majority, and that are still spectators essentially in the economy without being emotional about it. There's been talk of nationalize the Reserve Bank, occupy financial institutions, even cooperative banks that are not necessarily thriving in black communities. So how do you change that particular landscape?
Well, look, first, there are things that, in some of the things you've mentioned, that obviously I don't agree. Taking over banks, as well as taking over the Reserve Bank, for me, it's not going to change the landscape of the economy in this country. It's not going to do anything new, But what we need right now, because it's the ruling party, we need an ANC which is decisive on, I think, changing the landscape of the economy in this country, to enable black business to be able to do business, to be able to enjoy the large procurement cake of government. Government procured in excess of 500 billion rand. So we must stop this half-measured approach by the ruling party and be decisive on how best. If you go to Malaysia, it's quite clear. You want to get into business, you want a license, 51% of the license is with the locals. It's quite clear. But here, we're even arguing about issues of spectrum, which is a national asset, where the spectrum wants to be auctioned. Obviously, if you auction a national resource, those that have money will obviously be able to buy that out of auction. But government should be saying, with this national resource, how can we use it to propel the entrance of black businesses in this specific sector? And stop this wishy-washy.
And I want to talk about the expertise in those various sectors, because as you saw with the Equality Report, in terms of representation or transformation, where black management is still lagging behind, with 79% of executive positions being occupied by other groups, typically white and Indian, and black people still being at the bottom of the value chain. So how do you then use what we have currently to encourage trade among black people and to grow alternative industries so we're not dependent on what the status quo is?
Yeah, for me, again, I don't want to be locked on a debate where we're trying to look at white-owned companies that obviously black people are not occupying senior managerial positions. Because in essence, you can see that we're dealing with a white problem. That obviously whites in this country are resisting change. It's quite clear. In fact, they have, especially since the death of President Mandela, we have seen a reversal, in fact, of transformation to this country. We've seen major white-owned companies actually now reversing and appointing whites in those positions. What we need is to create, the government assist in creating deliberately large black-owned companies. Regarding the banks, we must see government saying banks should be able to set aside significant amounts of money to enable investment into black-owned companies. Right. Because we are not without skills. We have the skills, but we are just locked in white-owned companies. But if black people can be given their place in the sun to thrive, but we need a national economic transformation strategy for that.
Excuse me, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. So that is the CEO of the Small Development Institute and advisory panel member of the Broad Pool of Ideas, Xolani Qhubeka. Thank you indeed. And you at home, thanks for joining us. And we are on social media. You're welcome to share your thoughts there. We take a quick break. We'll see you shortly.